My fiancé told his brother I was so pathetic he had to get drunk just to sleep with me. I immediately canceled our wedding, repossessed the $90,000 car I bought him, and watched his entire life crumble into dust. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth and used your kindness against you. My name is Chloe. I am 31 years old and I work as a financial risk manager for high-profile athletes and entertainers. My job is to spot bad investments and cut them loose before they drain my clients dry. It is ironic that for 4 years I failed to see the biggest bad investment sitting right in my own living room. Last Thursday evening started like any other normal weekday. I had just wrapped up a grueling 10-hour shift negotiating a contract for a rookie basketball player. My shoulders were tight and my eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets all day. All I wanted was to take a hot shower and unbox the new espresso machine I ordered from Amazon. The delivery app notified me that the package had been dropped off on my front porch 3 hours earlier. When I walked to the front door and opened it, the porch was completely empty. Annoyed, I pulled out my phone and opened the Ring security app to see if a porch pirate had snatched my box. I scrubbed the video timeline back to the late afternoon. The camera did not capture a thief. Instead, it captured my fiancé Marcus standing on my porch with his older brother Trey and Trey's wife Sarah. Marcus and Trey were leaning against the brick railing smoking imported cigars that I had bought for Marcus as an early wedding gift. Sarah was sitting in the wicker patio chair holding a glass of my expensive red wine. Sarah always prided herself on being an ally, but consistently treated me with quiet, suffocating condescension. She loved giving unsolicited advice about keeping a man happy, as if my success was a barrier. I turned up the volume on my phone to see if they had mentioned moving my package inside. The audio kicked in sharp and clear. Trey took a drag of his cigar and laughed loudly. He slapped Marcus on the shoulder and asked if he was really ready to tie the knot and settle down with just one woman for the rest of his life. Marcus scoffed and blew a cloud of smoke toward the camera. He leaned in closer to his brother and lowered his voice, but the microphone caught every single syllable. "Man, let me tell you the truth," Marcus said with an arrogant smirk. "Chloe is entirely too boring and completely pathetic. She is always working or talking about portfolios. I swear to you I have to get blackout drunk or pretend she is that Instagram model from Miami just to sleep with her. It is a chore, bro." I froze. My heart stopped beating in my chest. I stared at the screen as Trey let out a booming laugh. I waited for Sarah to say something to defend me. I waited for her to scold them for being so cruel. Instead, Sarah giggled and took a sip of her wine. "Oh, come on, Marcus," she said in her sweet, sugary voice. "You cannot be that mad about it. At least she bought you that brand new Range Rover last month. Poor Chloe knows she is not exactly the most feminine or alluring woman, so she has to use her money to buy your love. Just let her spoil you and enjoy the perks of having a sugar mama." Marcus laughed and agreed, saying he was just securing his financial future. I stood in my hallway staring at the glowing screen of my phone. There were no tears. I did not scream or throw my phone against the wall. The emotional coldness that washed over me was absolute and terrifying. For 4 years I had paid the mortgage, funded his failed business ventures, and defended him to my mother, who thought he was a prize just because he was handsome. In less than 2 minutes, a security camera shattered the entire illusion of my life. I locked the front door and walked slowly into my home office. The man I was supposed to marry in 3 months did not love me. He despised me. He saw me as a pathetic bank account. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. I did not want an apology. I wanted complete financial and emotional annihilation right now today. I walked over to the reinforced steel safe tucked in the corner of my office. I typed in the 6-digit code and pulled the heavy metal door open. Inside were the backups of my most important files. I bypassed the client portfolios and reached for a thick black leather binder. I laid it on my desk and flipped through the clear plastic sleeves until I found the vehicle registration and the original title for the 2024 Range Rover. The paperwork did not have the name Marcus anywhere on it. The $90,000 vehicle was registered entirely to my company, Apex Financial Consulting. I had purchased it in cash 8 months ago. Marcus had convinced me that he needed a luxury vehicle to attract high-tier investors for his logistics startup. That so-called startup had generated exactly zero revenue in the 2 years since he pitched the idea. I had funded his website, his marketing materials, and the lease on his trendy downtown office space. I set the car title aside and turned my attention to my laptop. I logged into my banking portals. For the first time in 4 years, I stopped looking at my finances with the blind optimism of a woman in love. I looked at the numbers with the cold, calculating eyes of a risk manager. I pulled up the transaction history dating back to the month Marcus moved in with me. The screen populated with endless rows of red deductions. I saw the thousands spent on designer suits and luxury watches he wore to networking events that never led to a single contract. As I scrolled through the devastating financial reality, my mind drifted to my mother, Vivian. She was the architect of my insecurity. Growing up, Vivian made it abundantly clear that my intelligence was intimidating and my ambition was an unappealing liability. She used to lecture me constantly, telling me that a smart woman still needs a strong man to lead the household to be truly complete. When I first brought Marcus home, she acted like I had finally won the lottery. She fawned over his height, his smile, and his smooth-talking charm. "Oh, Chloe, he is so handsome and charismatic," she would say, deliberately ignoring the fact that his bank account was perpetually empty. Vivian told me it was my duty to support his grand vision until he got on his feet. She conditioned me to believe that my hard-earned financial success was only valuable if I used it to prop up a mediocre man. She convinced me I was lucky. He even chose me. I connected my laptop to the wireless printer sitting on the credenza. I hit print on every single bank statement from the last 48 months. The machine whirred to life, spitting out page after page of evidence. Every transfer to his checking account, every vacation I fully funded, every emergency cash injection he promised to pay back, but never did. The stack of paper grew thicker until it formed a towering monument to my foolishness. I highlighted the total amount he had drained, over $150,000 from my accounts, not even including the cost of the Range Rover. He was not a supportive partner building a life with me. He was a financial parasite, bleeding me dry while mocking my appearance to his friends. I placed the vehicle title and a copy of the final financial tally into a crisp manila folder. My hands were perfectly steady. My breathing was slow and controlled. I picked up my cell phone and opened the fleet management application linked to the Range Rover. Because the car was legally a company asset, I had required a GPS tracking unit to be installed for commercial insurance purposes. I refreshed the location data. The little blue beacon pulsed steadily on the digital map. The vehicle was parked outside the cigar lounge. He was probably still standing on that porch laughing at my expense with his brother Trey and that venomous wife of his. Tomorrow was Sunday. Both of our families were scheduled to gather for dinner at my mother Vivian's house. The purpose of the dinner was to finalize the menu and select the premium caterer for our upcoming wedding. They fully expected me to show up with my checkbook, ready to hand over a $30,000 deposit. They expected me to sit there quietly and smile while they planned a lavish future, built entirely on my money and my humiliation. I looked at the thick stack of printed statements resting on my desk. I closed the manila folder and slid it into my designer tote bag. I was going to give them the exact kind of Sunday dinner they deserved. I parked my car behind Trey's sedan outside my mother Vivian's house and took a deep breath. I grabbed the manila folder and tucked it safely into my oversized leather tote bag. The smell of roasted chicken and collard greens drifted through the front screen door. I pushed the door open and stepped into the bustling entryway. The house was loud and suffocatingly warm. Vivian was in the kitchen bustling around the stove while Trey and Marcus sat at the island laughing. As soon as Marcus saw me, he walked over with a bright, dazzling smile. He wrapped his arms around my waist and kissed my cheek, playing the role of the perfect, loving fiancé to absolute perfection. He told me I looked beautiful. It took every ounce of my self-control not to physically shove him away. I forced a stiff smile and said I was just tired. Vivian finally looked up from her cooking and wiped her hands on her apron. She did not ask how I was doing. Instead, she immediately complimented Marcus on his outfit and asked him if he wanted another glass of sweet tea. Sarah walked into the kitchen carrying a tray of appetizers. She was wearing a floral sundress and a smug expression. She set the tray down and immediately started in on me. She said it was a miracle I actually made it to dinner without being chained to my laptop. She told me I needed to learn how to prioritize my man because a successful career would not keep me warm at night. She smiled sweetly and said she was just looking out for my relationship. I nodded slowly and told her I appreciated her deep concern for my future. I walked past them and headed into the formal dining room. The large table was already set with Vivian's best china. This was the room where we were supposed to discuss the $30,000 catering budget and where they expected me to happily sign away my money to fund a fantasy. I took my usual seat at the head of the table next to the floor-standing speaker. The Bluetooth receiver was sitting right on the side table next to my chair. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, opened my settings menu, and navigated to the Bluetooth connections. I found the device named Vivian Living Room and tapped Connect. The phone vibrated, confirming the pairing. I lowered the volume so the initial connection sound would not be loud. My heart was beating in a steady, rhythmic thud. I was completely calm. Marcus and Trey walked into the dining room, still laughing about whatever joke they were discussing earlier. Marcus pulled out the chair next to me and sat down, placing his hand over mine. He looked into my eyes and told me he was so excited to finalize the menu today. He said he really wanted the premium seafood package because his networking friends would expect top-tier food. He was effortlessly spending my money in his mind. Sarah and Vivian followed them into the room carrying the main dishes. Vivian instructed everyone to take their seats so we could bless the food. She stood at the head of the table opposite me and looked around with a proud smile. She said she was so blessed to have both her boys sitting at her table. She actually called Marcus one of her boys. She said she could not wait to see Marcus and me build a beautiful life together. Everyone bowed their heads and Vivian began to pray. She prayed for our upcoming marriage and asked for blessings on our future finances. She prayed that I would learn to be a submissive wife. I kept my eyes open and stared at the man sitting next to me. I opened the audio file on my phone. The file was queued up right to the exact second where Marcus started speaking on the porch. Vivian finished her prayer and everyone said Amen. Marcus squeezed my hand and asked if I was ready to talk about the budget. I pulled my hand away from his grasp and picked up my phone. I looked at Marcus, then Sarah and Trey. I said I actually had a special presentation prepared for the budget meeting. I told them it was a brief audio recording to clarify exactly where my money was going. Marcus looked confused but smiled anyway, thinking it was some sort of corporate presentation I had put together. I hovered my thumb over the play button. The dining room was completely quiet except for the clinking of silverware as Sarah served herself a portion of chicken. I pressed play and immediately turned the volume all the way up to the maximum level. The brutal words ripped through the dining room with crystal-clear precision. I watched the color drain completely out of the face of Marcus as his own recorded voice echoed off the formal wallpaper. Man, let me tell you, Chloe is entirely too boring and completely pathetic. The recording continued broadcasting his arrogant confession about needing to be blackout drunk just to tolerate my presence. Trey dropped his fork. The heavy silver utensil clattered loudly against his porcelain plate. Sarah froze with her wineglass halfway to her lips, her eyes darting nervously toward me. I let the entire clip play all the way to the end, including Sarah giggling and mocking me for buying his love with a luxury vehicle. When the audio finally cut off, the silence in the room was deafening. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I sat perfectly still, looking directly at Marcus. I expected him to stutter or apologize. I expected Trey to look ashamed. Instead, the toxic dynamic of this family immediately shifted into high gear to protect their golden boy. Vivian slammed her hands down on the table, making the water glasses rattle. "Chloe, what on earth is wrong with you?" she yelled, her face turning red with anger. "Why would you play something like that at the dinner table? You do not air dirty laundry in front of everyone. You keep family business private." I stared at my mother in disbelief. She was not angry that the man I was supposed to marry had humiliated me. She was angry that I had ruined her perfect Sunday dinner. Men just talk big when they are around other men. Vivian continued waving her hand dismissively, as if Marcus had simply made a bad joke about the weather. "It does not mean anything. You are blowing this completely out of proportion and embarrassing yourself." Sarah seized the opportunity to jump and defend the brother of her husband. She set her wine glass down and leaned forward, putting on her most concerned, condescending expression. "Chloe, I really think you need to look inward right now," Sarah said, using her gentle therapy voice. "Recording Marcus without his consent is a massive violation of his boundaries. You are invading his safe space. It is actually a very toxic and controlling behavior on your part. You cannot expect a man to feel secure in a relationship when you are constantly surveilling him like a warden." I listened to the sheer absurdity of their words. They were actively gaslighting me in real time. They were trying to make me the villain for discovering his betrayal. Marcus seemed to gain confidence from his mother and sister-in-law rushing to his defense. He reached out and tried to grab my hand again, putting on a fake pleading look. "Baby, come on," he said softly. "You know how guys are when we drink and smoke. It was just locker room talk. I was just trying to sound cool in front of my brother. You know I love you. You know I want to marry you. Do not let your insecurities ruin what we have built together." He actually had the audacity to blame my insecurities. I looked around the table. At the four of them. Vivian glaring at me for being difficult. Sarah looking at me with fake pity. Trey refusing to make eye contact. Marcus trying to charm his way out of emotional abuse. I realized in that exact moment that I had spent years desperately trying to earn the respect of people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not try to explain my feelings or defend my actions because none of them deserved my energy. I simply reached over with my right hand and grabbed the diamond engagement ring sitting on my left ring finger. I pulled it off in one smooth motion. Marcus stopped talking and watched me, his eyes widening slightly. I held the ring over his crystal water glass and opened my fingers. The diamond dropped with a heavy plink, sinking instantly to the bottom of the ice water. "I am done," I said quietly. I stood up from the table, grabbed my oversized leather tote bag from the floor, and pushed my chair back. Vivian started yelling, again telling me to sit back down and act like an adult. Marcus stood up and called my name, but he did not follow me. I walked out of the dining room, through the warm kitchen, and straight out the front door. I got into my own luxury car, locked the heavy doors, and drove away into the cool, quiet evening air, leaving them to sit there and choke on their own suffocating toxicity and endless lies. It was Friday night, 5 days after the disaster at my mother's house. My phone had been buzzing constantly all week with text messages and voicemails from Marcus. He genuinely believed that my silence was just a temporary tantrum. In his arrogant mind, I was just a bitter woman giving him the silent treatment until my anger cooled off. He sent me flowers and typed out long paragraphs about how much he needed me and how we could work through this tiny misunderstanding. I did not respond to a single message. I spent my week working and preparing. I was sitting at my kitchen island with a glass of sparkling water when I opened the fleet management application on my tablet. I watched the little blue icon representing the $90,000 Range Rover blink steadily on the digital map. Marcus had been driving it all week, acting like nothing had changed. Tonight, the Icon was moving rapidly down the interstate, heading straight into the heart of downtown Atlanta. I zoomed in on the map and watched as the vehicle came to a complete stop on a busy street known for its exclusive nightlife. The GPS coordinates pinpointed the exact location outside a high-end nightclub called the Velvet Room. It was a notoriously expensive venue where men like Marcus went to buy overpriced bottles of champagne they could not afford just to impress women who did not care about them. He was undoubtedly out with his friends, or a new mistress spending the allowance I used to provide, and using my company vehicle to project an image of wealth. I just smiled very coldly. The time for waiting was over. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for a premium commercial towing and recovery service I frequently used for my business clients. The dispatcher answered immediately. I gave him my name and my company identification number. I told him I needed an immediate commercial asset recovery at the Velvet Room in downtown Atlanta. I provided the exact make-model license plate and vehicle identification number. I explained that I had the title in hand and the vehicle was illegally possessed by an unauthorized driver. The dispatcher told me a driver would be dispatched right away and would arrive at the venue in approximately 20 minutes. I thanked him and hung up. Next, I found the direct non-emergency number for the local police precinct covering the downtown entertainment district. When the desk sergeant answered, I introduced myself as the managing director of Apex Financial Consulting. I kept my voice perfectly professional and calm. I told the officer that my company was conducting a commercial repossession of a high-value company asset at a busy nightclub, and I was requesting a police presence for a civil standby. I explained that the unauthorized driver had a history of volatile behavior, and I wanted to ensure there was no breach of the peace when the tow truck arrived. The sergeant took down the details and confirmed that 2 patrol officers would be dispatched to the location to oversee the property transfer and maintain public order. Everything was locked into place. The tactical precision of my plan left absolutely no room for him to manipulate his way out of the situation. I walked into my bedroom and changed into a sharp-tailored black suit. I wanted to look exactly like the successful executive I was, not the pathetic woman he described on that porch camera. I grabbed the manila folder containing the vehicle title, the corporate registration, and a printed copy of the GPS tracking log. I slid my phone into my pocket and ordered a premium Uber ride to take me to the club. I did not want to drive myself and have to deal with finding parking in the chaos that was about to unfold. I wanted to be dropped off right at the front door just as the trap snapped shut. My Uber arrived in less than 5 minutes. I climbed into the back seat and instructed the driver to take the quickest route to downtown. As we merged onto the highway, I opened the tracking app one more time. The blue dot was perfectly stationary outside the club. Marcus was inside drinking and dancing, completely oblivious to the fact that the lavish lifestyle he had stolen from me was about to be violently ripped away in front of the entire city. I leaned back against the smooth leather seat and calmly watched the bright city lights blur past my tinted window. My heart beat with a steady, powerful rhythm of pure anticipation. The pathetic game of pretending was finally and officially over forever, and his brutal public consequences were rapidly approaching on a flatbed tow truck tonight. My Uber pulled up to the curb just half a block away from the glowing neon entrance of the Velvet Room. I handed the driver a cash tip and stepped out onto the busy pavement, smoothing down the jacket of my black suit. The crisp night air buzzed with the heavy bass of hip-hop music spilling out from the club doors. I stood near a row of parked cars blending into the shadows cast by a large street lamp. I did not have to wait long. A massive flatbed tow truck turned the corner, its bright amber lights flashing rhythmically against the brick walls of the surrounding buildings. The heavy diesel engine rumbled loudly, drowning out the chatter of the people waiting in the VIP line. The tow truck driver, a large man wearing a reflective yellow vest, expertly backed his rig right up to the front bumper of the pristine white Range Rover. The crowd outside the club immediately noticed the commotion. People started pulling out their phones to record the scene. Repossessions outside of luxury clubs were always a favorite spectacle for social media. The tow driver hopped out of his cab, unspooled the heavy metal winch cable, and dropped to his knees to secure the hooks to the front axle of the luxury vehicle. The metal chains clanked loudly, echoing down the street. It only took about 60 seconds for the bouncer at the front door to realize what was happening and radio inside. A few moments later, the heavy velvet ropes were shoved aside, and the heavy oak doors of the club swung open violently. Marcus stormed out onto the sidewalk, looking absolutely frantic. He was wearing a custom-tailored velvet blazer that I had paid for, and a heavy gold chain that he bought using my credit card. He was holding a glass of expensive champagne in one hand. Trailing right behind him was a beautiful young woman in a tight red dress holding a designer clutch. She was looking around in utter confusion. Behind her were three of his networking friends, the same men he constantly bragged to about his imaginary wealth. Marcus pushed his way through the crowd of onlookers and marched right up to the tow truck driver. He threw his arms up in the air, spilling champagne onto the pavement. He demanded to know what the driver was doing and ordered him to unhook the vehicle immediately. The tow driver did not even flinch. He calmly stood up, wiped his hands on his pants, and told Marcus that the vehicle was scheduled for a commercial repossession by the legal owner. Marcus lost his mind. His face turned bright red as he started screaming at the top of his lungs. He puffed out his chest and tried to physically intimidate the much larger tow driver. He shouted that there was a massive mistake. He pointed a finger in the face of the driver and aggressively declared that he was a highly successful tech entrepreneur and the founder of a major logistics company. He yelled that he paid cash for the Range Rover and that nobody had the right to touch his property. The crowd of onlookers started laughing and whispering among themselves. The young woman in the red dress took a few steps back, looking incredibly embarrassed to be associated with him. Marcus noticed the crowd recording him, and his panic deepened into pure rage. He desperately needed to maintain the fake persona he had carefully crafted for these people. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his thick wallet, flashing a stack of cash. He tried to bribe the tow driver, offering him $500 on the spot to just drop the car and drive away. He told the driver he would clear up the paperwork error with his bank in the morning. The tow driver shook his head, hit a button on his control panel, and the winch began to mechanically grind. The front tires of the $90,000 Range Rover slowly lifted off the pavement. Marcus screamed again, telling the driver he was going to sue him and the towing company for everything they had. He yelled that he had powerful lawyers on retainer and that this illegal seizure would cost them millions. He was completely out of control, throwing a massive public temper tantrum while his friends watched in stunned silence. I stood in the shadows, perfectly still, just watching the beautiful collapse of his carefully constructed lies. He was exposing his own fragile ego to the entire city. The loud grinding noise of the tow truck winch was the most beautiful sound I had heard. I took a deep breath and prepared myself. The loud police sirens began to wail in the distance. Two black and white patrol cruisers pulled up to the curb, their red and blue lights washing over the panicked face of Marcus. 4 officers stepped out of the vehicles and approached the chaotic scene. Marcus immediately dropped his aggressive posture and shifted into his smooth-talking businessman persona. He walked over to the tallest officer with his hands held out in a gesture of total innocence. He put on a charming smile and explained that there was just a massive misunderstanding with his bank. He told the officers that he was a very important man in the tech industry and that this tow truck driver was trying to illegally seize his personal vehicle. He pointed to the white Range Rover dangling from the winch and claimed he had paid for it in cash just 8 months ago. The officers listened patiently to his lies. One officer pulled out a notepad and asked Marcus for his driver license and the registration for the vehicle. Marcus patted his pockets and laughed nervously, saying the registration was locked inside the glove compartment. He told the officer his name was Marcus and assured them they could just run his name through their database to prove he was the owner. He even turned around to smile at the crowd, acting like he had the entire situation under complete control. That was my cue. I stepped out from the dark shadows of the street lamp and walked directly toward the officers. My black suit blended perfectly with the night, but the sharp click of my heels on the pavement drew the attention of everyone standing on the sidewalk. Marcus froze when he saw me. The arrogant smile vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a look of absolute horror. His mistress in the red dress stared at me with wide eyes, clearly sensing that the web of lies she had been fed was about to unravel. I ignored Marcus completely. I walked straight up to the officer holding the notepad and introduced myself. I told him I was the managing director of Apex Financial Consulting and the legal owner of the vehicle currently secured to the tow truck. I opened my manila folder and handed the officer the original title, the corporate registration documents, and my personal identification. I kept my voice loud enough for the entire crowd of onlookers to hear every single word. I explained that the man standing next to him was an unauthorized driver who had absolutely no ownership stake in the company asset. The officer took my documents and shined his flashlight over the paperwork. He examined the raised seal on the state title and verified the corporate name. He looked at my identification and then looked over at Marcus. The officer handed my paperwork back to me and turned to face my former fiancé. "Sir, your name is not anywhere on these documents," the officer said in a firm, loud voice. "This vehicle belongs to the LLC registered to this woman. You need to step away from the tow truck and allow the driver to complete his job." Marcus snapped. The calm, charming facade completely shattered. He lunged forward and pointed a shaking finger at my face. He screamed that I was a crazy, bitter woman trying to ruin his life because we had a minor argument. He yelled to the crowd that I was his fiancée and that we shared all of our assets. He claimed he built the business with me and that I was just trying to steal his car out of pure jealousy. The crowd of Atlanta elites started whispering and pointing. A few people burst out laughing at his desperation. The officers immediately stepped between us, placing their hands on their duty belts and instructing Marcus to back away. He refused to listen. He threw his champagne glass onto the ground, shattering it into 100 pieces across the sidewalk. His mistress gasped and covered her mouth, taking another huge step away from him. His networking friends, the men he tried so hard to impress, looked completely mortified by his public meltdown. They quietly backed into the crowd, pretending they did not even know him. Marcus was losing everything he cared about in real time. His image, his fake wealth, and his pride were being dismantled in front of the very people he worshipped. He screamed at the officers, calling them names and threatening to have their badges. He yelled that he was not going to let some bitter woman take his property. He took an aggressive step toward the officer who had checked my paperwork. He raised his fists up into the air and began to wildly curse at the top of his lungs, demanding respect from everyone watching him. That was a mistake. The officer did not hesitate. As soon as Marcus raised his hands and lunged forward, the officer grabbed his right arm, twisted it sharply behind his back, and slammed him face first against the side of the flashing patrol cruiser. The metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly. Marcus let out a muffled cry of shock as his cheek was pressed hard against the cold steel of the police car. The second officer quickly stepped in, grabbing his other arm to secure the restraints. "You are under arrest for public intoxication and disorderly conduct," the officer announced loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear. "If you continue to resist, we will add assaulting a police officer to the list of charges. Do you understand me?" Marcus stopped fighting immediately. All the fight and fake bravado drained right out of him. He was breathing heavily, his expensive velvet blazer now scuffed and stained. He turned his head slightly and locked eyes with me. There was no anger left in his expression anymore. There was only absolute panic and deep humiliation. He opened his mouth to say something to beg me to stop this, but the officer pushed his head back down and began reading him his Miranda rights. The crowd of onlookers was absolutely merciless. Dozens of cell phone cameras were pointed directly at him, recording his spectacular downfall from every possible angle. The footage of the self-proclaimed wealthy entrepreneur crying in handcuffs was going to be all over social media by morning. I saw the young woman in the red dress frantically waving down a passing taxi. She climbed inside and sped away without giving Marcus a single backward glance. His so-called wealthy friends had completely vanished into the night, abandoning him the second he became a liability. The tow truck driver finished securing the heavy chains around the front tires of the Range Rover. He gave me a quick nod of acknowledgement, climbed into the cab of his truck, and put the massive vehicle into gear. The diesel engine roared, and the truck slowly pulled away from the curb, taking the $90,000 symbol of Marcus and his fake success with it. I watched the taillights of the tow truck disappear around the corner, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief wash over my entire body. I had severed the financial parasite. The officers patted Marcus down, retrieving his wallet and his cell phone. They opened the rear door of the cruiser and forcefully guided him into the back seat, pushing down on his head so he would clear the doorframe. The heavy door slammed shut with a loud, definitive thud. He was trapped behind the reinforced glass and thick metal wire mesh. He pressed his face against the window, staring at me as the patrol car shifted into drive. The red and blue lights flashed brightly against the brick walls as the cruiser pulled away from the curb and merged into the heavy downtown traffic, heading straight for the county jail. I stood on the sidewalk alone, breathing in the cool night air. The chaos outside the club slowly began to dissipate. The bouncers moved the velvet ropes back into place and the line of people returned to their conversations, though most of them were still eagerly sharing the videos they had just recorded. My phone vibrated in the pocket of my blazer. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. I had 3 missed calls from my mother, Vivian, and 2 text messages from Trey. Word had already reached them. Someone at the club must have recognized Marcus and called his brother. The text messages from Trey were furious, demanding to know what I had done and telling me I had crossed a line I could never uncross. He called me a bitter, vindictive woman who was destroying her own family. I smiled and turned my phone completely off. I was not going to let their toxic panic ruin the peace of my evening. I hailed a passing cab and gave the driver my home address. As I rode back to my quiet, empty house, I knew exactly what was coming next. The arrest was only the opening battle. Marcus being locked in a holding cell was going to trigger the full wrath of his enablers. Vivian and Sarah were going to launch a massive campaign to paint me as the villain and Marcus as the innocent victim of a crazy woman. They were going to demand apologies and financial restitution. They were going to try to shame me into submission, just like they always did. But they had no idea who they were dealing with anymore. The pathetic woman who craved their approval was gone. I was ready for war. The sun rose on Saturday morning, casting a bright, unforgiving light over the sprawling city of Atlanta. I woke up feeling more rested than I had in 4 entire years. I brewed a hot cup of black coffee and sat down at my kitchen island, opening my laptop to review some major client portfolios. My peace was broken exactly at 9 in the morning when the daily notifications on my mobile phone suddenly began to explode. A continuous stream of chimes and buzzes vibrated against the marble countertop. Trey had apparently gone down to the county courthouse first thing in the morning and posted bail for his brother. Marcus was finally out of jail, and the family damage control machine had officially been activated. But surprisingly, Marcus was not the one leading the charge today. It was his sister-in-law, Sarah. Sarah had immediately taken to Facebook and Instagram to launch a massive, highly coordinated smear campaign against me. She posted a long, dramatic essay accompanied by a black and white photo of Marcus looking stressed and victimized. I read through her lengthy post and felt a cold wave of disgust wash over me. Sarah used every ounce of her white privilege to play the ultimate victim by proxy. She weaponized therapy language and subtle racial stereotypes to completely rewrite the narrative of what happened last night. She painted herself as the heartbroken peacemaker watching her family be torn apart by a malicious, vindictive woman. She did not mention the cheating or the horrific audio recording. Instead, Sarah explicitly framed me as an angry, bitter black woman who could not handle a simple disagreement without resorting to extreme emotional and financial abuse. Her post claimed that I had maliciously set up her innocent brother-in-law out of sheer jealousy because I was intimidated by his entrepreneurial success. She wrote that I had gifted him a vehicle only to illegally snatch it back the second my fragile ego was bruised. She told her thousands of followers that I had orchestrated a public arrest to humiliate a good, hard-working black man who was just trying to build a legacy. The sheer audacity of her lies was breathtaking. She was actively using her platform as a wealthy white woman to paint me as the aggressive, unhinged villain while shielding the man who had been bleeding me dry. The comments section of her post was a toxic wasteland of her friends and church members sending prayers for her family and condemning my actions. People who had never even met me were calling me a psycho and a gold digger in reverse. As I read through the hateful comments, my phone screen shifted to an incoming call. It was my mother, Vivian. I let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, she called again. I let it ring. She immediately followed up with a barrage of frantic text messages. I opened the text thread and watched her words fill the screen. She was absolutely hysterical. She demanded to know why I had humiliated Marcus in front of his friends. She ordered me to call the police station and drop the charges immediately. She told me I was embarrassing the entire family and that Sarah was completely right about my toxic behavior. Vivian wrote that I needed to swallow my pride, apologize to Marcus, and buy the car back before I ended up alone for the rest of my life. She said I was throwing away a good man over a petty misunderstanding, and that I would never find anyone else willing to put up with my demanding career. My mother was siding with the woman who was publicly assassinating my character on the internet. Vivian was more concerned about maintaining the illusion of a perfect family than protecting her daughter from emotional abuse and financial ruin. I took a screenshot of the ridiculous social media post from Sarah and saved it into the evidence folder on my desktop. I did the same with every single unhinged text message Vivian sent me. They thought this public shaming would break me. They thought that turning the community against me would force me to back down and beg for their forgiveness. They severely underestimated my ability to compartmentalize and destroy. I was a financial risk manager. I dealt with hostile takeovers and bad investments every single day of my professional career. They were treating this like a petty high school drama, but I was treating it like a corporate liquidation. I was not going to fight them on social media where emotions ruled. I was going to fight them with the numbers. I opened my accounting software and began pulling the transaction logs to start my investigation. The real warfare had not even truly started yet. I poured a cup of black coffee and settled into my desk chair, shutting out the noise. I turned my cell phone off, tossing it onto the sofa. I ignored the text messages from my mother and the hateful comments piling up under the post Sarah had written. They operated on raw emotion and desperation, but I operated on hard financial data. As a financial risk manager, my entire career was built on finding the hidden leaks in complex corporate portfolios. I knew how to follow the money better than anyone they had ever met. I booted up my secure workstation and launched my proprietary forensic accounting software. This was the same software I used to audit multi-million-dollar contracts for professional athletes. I linked all of my personal and business banking portals to the system, allowing the algorithm to download and categorize every single transaction from the past 4 years. The initial scan confirmed what I already knew. Marcus had bled my primary checking account dry with his constant lifestyle expenses. But I was not looking for the small petty theft anymore. I wanted to see the entire structural foundation of his lies. I expanded the search parameters to include my secondary accounts, my investment portfolios, and the private trust fund my grandfather had established for me decades ago. I rarely checked the trust fund because it was designed to mature slowly over time, and I had instructed the bank to automatically reinvest the dividends. It was my safety net, untouched and secure. Or so I thought. The software completed its deep scan of the trust account and flagged a massive anomaly. A bright red notification popped up on my screen indicating a critical variance in the ledger balance. I clicked on the alert and stared at the detailed transaction log. My blood ran completely cold. Exactly 4 months ago, a single wire transfer of $150,000 had been executed from my trust account. The money had been moved directly into an external commercial checking account. I sat frozen in my chair, my eyes scanning the digital receipt. I had never authorized a withdrawal of that magnitude from that specific account. In order to move funds from the trust, the bank required a signed physical authorization form and a secondary identity verification. I quickly accessed the secure document portal provided by my banking institution and requested the archival copy of the transfer request. The PDF document loaded onto my monitor. I looked at the bottom of the page. There on the signature line was my name. The handwriting was a remarkably close imitation of my personal signature, but it was slightly too rigid. The loop on the letter C was forced, and the angle of the final letter was completely wrong. It was a blatant forgery. Marcus had practiced my signature, stolen my secure account routing numbers, and forged a legal document to bypass the bank's security protocols. He did not just cheat on me with another woman. He had committed textbook wire fraud and identity theft. I needed to know exactly where that money went. I copied the routing and account numbers of the receiving bank listed on the forged wire transfer document. I opened a new browser window and logged into the state corporate registry database. I ran a reverse search on the receiving account details to identify the holding company. The database took a few seconds to process the query before returning a match. The receiving account belonged to a limited liability company registered as Apex Elite Fitness LLC. I scrolled down to the ownership section of the corporate filing. The registered agents and primary shareholders of Apex Elite Fitness LLC were listed in bold black text. The names were Trey and Sarah. The entire puzzle instantly clicked together in my mind, forming a picture of absolute betrayal. 3 months ago, Sarah had flooded her social media with proud announcements about opening her brand new luxury boutique gym in the trendy downtown district. She had bragged endlessly about her husband Trey and his brilliant business acumen, claiming they had secured a massive private investment to fund their dream. My mother Vivian had praised them for their hard work and entrepreneurial spirit, constantly comparing Marcus and his lack of progress to his highly successful brother. The truth was violently different. There was no brilliant business acumen. There was no legitimate private investment. Their luxury gym was built on federal crimes and stolen money. The fake outrage Sarah was projecting on the internet was not about protecting her family at all. It was pure and absolute panic. They knew that if I finally kicked Marcus out and cut off his endless allowance, I would eventually audit all of my personal accounts. This situation was no longer just a simple, messy, emotional breakup between two incompatible people. The absolute stakes had just escalated to federal prison. The absolute stakes had just escalated to federal prison. I spent the rest of the weekend meticulously downloading and securing every single piece of financial evidence. I backed up the forged wire transfer documents, the state corporate registry filings, and the bank routing histories onto 3 separate encrypted drives. I did not contact the authorities immediately. I knew that in financial warfare, patience was the ultimate weapon. I needed to let them think they were winning. I needed them to become so arrogant and so confident in their fake victimhood that they would make a fatal mistake. That mistake arrived on my front porch exactly 4 days later. It was Tuesday morning, and I was preparing for a conference call when the doorbell rang. I walked downstairs and opened the heavy oak door. A man in a cheap gray suit was standing on my welcome mat holding a thick manila envelope. He asked if I was Chloe. I nodded, and he shoved the envelope into my hands, telling me I had been officially served before quickly walking back to his car. I locked the door and walked into my kitchen, sliding my finger under the flap of the envelope. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on cheap paper. The header at the top of the first page bore the logo of a low-tier local law firm known for handling desperate personal injury claims and messy divorces. I scanned the first paragraph and let out a sharp laugh. Marcus was suing me. He was not just suing me for the return of the luxury vehicle. He was filing a massive civil lawsuit demanding $500,000 in palimony and a 20% ownership stake in my firm, Apex Financial Consulting. I leaned against the marble counter and read through the absolute absurdity of his legal demands. Marcus and his discount attorney were claiming that because we had cohabitated for 4 years, We were essentially operating under a common law marriage. They argued that during those 4 years, he had acted as an unpaid crucial consultant for my business. The lawsuit claimed that his networking skills and strategic advice were the primary reasons my financial management firm had secured so many high-profile clients. He was literally demanding $500,000 for going to expensive parties on my dime and drinking my alcohol. It was incredibly obvious that Sarah and her social media mob had deeply emboldened him. Reading through the legal jargon, I could clearly see the toxic influence of his sister-in-law. The document painted me as a manipulative corporate executive who had exploited his entrepreneurial genius and then discarded him the moment he tried to establish his own independence. They genuinely believed they had me completely cornered and utterly trapped without any viable options. They thought I would be so terrified of the public embarrassment of a messy legal battle that I would immediately offer a quiet settlement to make it all go away. They assumed I would gladly write a check for $500,000 just to protect my professional reputation in the highly competitive financial sector. They wanted to use the legal system to bleed me dry one final time to fund the fraudulent boutique gym he and Trey were running. Marcus thought he was playing a brilliant strategic game of high-stakes chess. He thought hiring a lawyer and serving me with papers would force me to surrender and apologize. He was operating under the delusion that he held all the power because he was loud and demanding. What Marcus and his cheap lawyer did not understand was that by filing this civil lawsuit, they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them permanently. I walked back upstairs to my office and placed the lawsuit on my desk right next to the forensic audit proving his wire fraud. I read the specific paragraph in the lawsuit where Marcus swore under penalty of perjury that he had intimate knowledge of my corporate finances and had actively participated in managing my accounts. He thought that statement proved he deserved half of my business. In reality, that sworn statement officially tied him to the forged wire transfers. He had just voluntarily submitted a signed legal document admitting he had access to the exact accounts he used to steal $150,000. He had essentially drafted his own criminal confession and paid a lawyer to deliver it directly to my front door. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in Atlanta. I was not going to cower or offer a single penny to settle. I was going to use his own lawsuit to bury him. The very next morning, my phone rang with a number I had not seen in years. It was Pastor Thomas from the church my mother had attended since I was a little girl. I answered the call and his deep, soothing voice came through the speaker. He told me that Vivian had come to his office in tears, begging him to intervene in a severe family crisis. According to my mother, my soul was in deep jeopardy because I was letting greed and anger destroy my future husband. She had convinced this pastor to host a formal family mediation in his private study at the church later that evening. The pastor explained that it would be a safe space governed by faith where we could resolve our financial disputes quietly and avoid tearing the community apart. He told me Marcus and his family had already agreed to attend and were simply praying for my cooperation. I knew exactly who had orchestrated this entire theatrical production: Sarah. She knew that attempting to negotiate a massive financial settlement through lawyers would expose their fraudulent gym. She needed to trap me in a room with a religious authority figure and use spiritual guilt to force my hand. Sarah figured that if they surrounded me with my mother and the pastor, I would eventually cave under the overwhelming pressure and agree to pay Marcus off just to restore the peace. They wanted me to sign a private settlement agreement, dropping the towing charges and handing over a lump sum of cash to make the lawsuit disappear. They were using the church as a weapon of emotional blackmail. I did not argue with the pastor. I kept my tone perfectly polite and told him I would be there at exactly 6 p.m. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for the meeting. I did not bring my lawyer. Bringing legal counsel would have immediately put them on the defensive, and I needed them to feel completely in control of the situation. I needed them to be incredibly arrogant. I walked into my closet and pulled out a sleek black leather briefcase. I carefully placed the encrypted drive containing the forensic accounting records inside. I added the forged wire transfer documents, the state corporate registry filings, and a fresh printed copy of the ridiculous lawsuit Marcus had served me. Finally, I took out a small, high-definition digital audio recorder I used for client meetings, checked the battery life, and slid it into the front pocket of my blazer. I drove across town to the church, arriving 10 minutes early. The parking lot was mostly empty except for my mother's sedan and a silver SUV I recognized as belonging to Trey and Sarah. I walked through the heavy wooden doors of the sanctuary and headed down the quiet carpeted hallway toward the pastoral offices. The air smelled faintly of old paper and floor wax. I knocked once on the heavy oak door of the study and turned the brass handle. The room was tense and suffocatingly warm. Pastor Thomas was sitting behind his large mahogany desk, his hands clasped together in a posture of deep concern. My mother Vivian was sitting on a small sofa clutching a tissue and looking at me with an expression of profound disappointment. Across the room, sitting in high-backed leather chairs, were Marcus, Trey, and Sarah. Marcus was wearing a conservative button-down shirt, trying to look humble and aggrieved. Trey sat rigidly with his arms crossed over his chest, projecting an aura of protective authority. Sarah was sitting right next to Marcus, holding a leather-bound notebook and a silver pen, looking like she was ready to take minutes at a corporate board meeting. She gave me a tight, patronizing smile as I walked into the room. She honestly believed she was the smartest person in the entire building. I walked over to the only empty wooden chair in the room, placing my sleek leather briefcase gently on the floor next to my feet. I did not say a word. I simply sat down, crossed my legs, and looked directly at the pastor, waiting for the performance to begin. Pastor Thomas cleared his throat and opened his Bible, offering a brief prayer about forgiveness, unity, and the dangers of letting worldly possessions divide a family. I kept my eyes open, watching the faces of the people who were actively trying to steal my entire life. When the prayer ended, the pastor closed his book and looked over at Sarah, giving her a gentle, encouraging nod. Sarah immediately leaned forward, opening her notebook. She was actively taking the lead, just as I had expected her to do, ready to dictate the precise terms of my total surrender. Sarah adjusted her posture and looked at me with an expression of practiced sympathy. "Chloe, we are all here today because we love you," she began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "But we need to have a very honest conversation about the destructive path you are walking down right now. You have been incredibly blessed with financial success, and we are all very proud of you for that. But you have let your money harden your heart. Wealth does not make you a woman, Chloe. Grace makes you a woman. Forgiveness makes you a woman. Tearing down the man you were supposed to marry over a minor disagreement and a car is not strength, it is bitterness." I kept my face completely blank, making sure the digital recorder in my pocket was capturing every single word of her unhinged monologue. Sarah continued to speak, treating me like a disobedient child. She explained that Marcus had dedicated 4 years of his life to supporting my demanding career, and that he had sacrificed his own entrepreneurial goals to be my partner. She actually claimed that pulling the car away from him was a form of financial abuse. "You cannot just strip a man of his dignity because your feelings got hurt," Sarah said, shaking her head. "Marcus deserves to be compensated for the time and energy he invested in you. The lawsuit he filed is just his way of asking for fairness. We want to settle this quietly today, without courts and without any more police." My mother Vivian let out a loud, dramatic sob and reached across the space to grab my knee. "Please, Chloe." Vivian begged, tears streaming down her face. "Just drop the towing charges and give Marcus the financial settlement he is asking for. You have more than enough money. Why are you trying to destroy these men? Trey and Marcus are trying to build a legacy for this family. It is your duty to protect them, not throw them to the wolves. A good woman builds her man up even when he makes a mistake. You are going to be so lonely if you keep acting like you do not need anyone." Marcus sat entirely silent next to his sister-in-law. He did not offer a single word of apology for the horrific things he had said about me on that porch. He did not express any remorse for cheating or stealing. He just sat there with his legs crossed, looking incredibly smug. He was letting the women in his family do his dirty work, manipulating the religious setting to bully me into submission. He genuinely believed I was breaking under the weight of their combined guilt trip. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on my knees. I wanted to make absolutely sure the microphone picked up my next question. So just to be perfectly clear, I said, keeping my voice calm and even. You all believe that Marcus is fundamentally entitled to my money. You believe that because we dated, he has a legal and moral right to $500,000 of the wealth I built entirely on my own. Sarah smiled, nodding her head, as if I was finally understanding a very simple concept. Yes, Chloe, she said confidently. He is entitled to it. You used his charm and his networking skills to elevate your own business. He put up with your constant working and your cold personality. He earned that money. He deserves a cut of your business and a lump sum to start his own life properly. It is only fair after what you put him through. Vivian nodded enthusiastically, wiping her eyes with her tissue. It is the right thing to do, baby, she said. Just pay him what he deserves, so we can all heal and move forward as a family. Give him the money, and let us put this ugly mess behind us. The pastor murmured in agreement, praising my mother for her forgiving spirit. They had done it. They had just explicitly stated on a digital recording that they felt entirely entitled to extort me. They had admitted that the lawsuit was not about real legal damages, but about forcing me to pay him off for simply tolerating my personality. They were so blinded by their own arrogance and greed that they did not realize they were digging their own graves right inside the church study. I reached down and picked up the sleek leather briefcase from the floor, setting it squarely on my lap. The psychological battle was officially over, and I had captured every single piece of evidence I needed. The time for listening to their delusions had passed. I popped the small brass latches on the briefcase and let them snap open. The sharp metallic click of the brass latches echoing in the quiet study made everyone suddenly shift in their seats. I did not immediately pull the documents out of the briefcase. I let the heavy leather lid rest open and looked directly across the room at Sarah. You talk a lot about grace and forgiveness, Sarah, I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured. You sit there with your notebook and your condescending smile telling me that my wealth does not make me a woman. You want me to believe that a real woman is defined by how much disrespect she is willing to absorb from a mediocre man just to keep a relationship intact. You are trying to weaponize my race and my gender against me. You want me to play the role of the strong but suffering Black woman who silently carries the financial and emotional burden of the entire family while the men get to play entrepreneur with my money? I shook my head slowly. I am not playing that role anymore, and I am certainly not taking life advice from a woman whose entire lifestyle is funded by other people. Sarah blinked rapidly, her fake smile faltering for the first time since I walked into the church. She opened her mouth to argue, but I raised my hand, silencing her instantly. You had your turn to speak earlier, Sarah, I said. Now you are going to sit there and listen. I turned my attention to my mother. Vivian was still clutching her crumpled tissue, but the tears had completely stopped. You told me it is my duty to protect the men of this family, I said, staring right into her eyes. You raised me to believe that my ambition was a character flaw, and my only real value was propping up someone like Marcus. You looked the other way while he lived off my paycheck for 4 years. You never once asked me if I was tired. You never once asked me if I felt loved. You only cared that the family picture looked perfect on a Sunday afternoon. Well, the picture was a lie, Vivian. Marcus is not a visionary, and he is not a provider. He is a financial parasite, and you enabled him every single step of the way because you are terrified of the reality that women like me do not actually need men like him to survive. Vivian looked completely and utterly stunned. Pastor Thomas shifted awkwardly in his large chair, clearing his throat as if he wanted to intervene, but the absolute authority in my voice kept him pinned to his seat. I finally turned my gaze to Marcus and Trey. They were sitting close together, projecting a united front of arrogant entitlement. "You filed a lawsuit claiming that you acted as a crucial consultant for my business, Marcus," I said, leaning forward slightly. "You told your cheap lawyer that your networking skills were the foundation of my success. You are demanding $500,000 and a 20% stake in my firm because you believe your supposed contributions entitle you to my assets." Marcus puffed out his chest and nodded confidently. "That is exactly right," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I introduced you to high-value clients. I gave you strategic advice. I built that brand with you, Chloe. You cannot just lock me out and keep all the profits for yourself. It is completely unethical." I looked over at Trey, who was nodding in agreement with his brother. "And you support this claim, Trey?" I asked. "You agree that Marcus is a brilliant businessman whose hard work and financial savvy are the real reasons your family is experiencing all this recent success? You believe his entrepreneurial skills are what provided the capital for your new luxury gym?" Trey scoffed and leaned back in his leather chair. "Absolutely," he said with a smug grin. "Marcus is the smartest guy I know. He knows how to move money and make things happen. He has been the financial backbone of our family projects for months. You are just mad because he finally realized his worth and stopped letting you control him." I took a slow, deep breath. The digital audio recorder in my pocket was capturing every single syllable of their profound stupidity. They were so desperate to validate his bruised ego and justify their extortion attempt that they were actively bragging about his financial maneuvering. They had just explicitly confirmed that Marcus was the source of the funds used to open the boutique gym. They had tied themselves completely to his financial timeline. The trap was now fully closed. I reached my hands inside the open briefcase and placed my fingers on the thick stack of forensic accounting records. I pulled the thick stack of forensic accounting records from the black leather briefcase and dropped it heavily onto the center of the mahogany desk. Pastor Thomas jumped slightly at the sudden noise. I slid the top folder across the polished wood directly toward Sarah and Trey. "Go ahead and open it," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "That is a comprehensive forensic audit of every single financial account registered to my name over the last 4 years. Sarah looked down at the folder with a sudden flicker of hesitation, but Trey confidently snatched it up and flipped it open. He expected to see a list of credit card bills or minor expenses. Instead, he found the bank-certified documentation of a massive federal crime. I did not give them time to process the numbers before I dropped the next piece of paper right on top of the open folder. "That is a wire transfer request," I explained, pointing to the highlighted section of the document. "Exactly 4 months ago, someone bypassed my banking security protocols and authorized a direct transfer of $150,000 from my private trust fund. They did not just move the money between my accounts. They wired it entirely out of my financial ecosystem into an external commercial checking account." Marcus shifted in his seat, his face suddenly losing all its arrogant color. Vivian gasped and asked what I was talking about. I kept my eyes locked on Sarah. "The most interesting part of that wire transfer is the signature at the bottom of the page," I said. "It is a very impressive forgery. Someone practiced my handwriting and signed a legally binding banking document to steal a small fortune. But they were incredibly sloppy with the destination." I pulled out the state corporate registry filings and placed them next to the forged wire transfer. I traced my finger over the bold black text. "The receiving account for the stolen $150,000 belongs to Apex Elite Fitness LLC. The registered owners are Trey and Sarah." The room plunged into a suffocating silence. Sarah stared at the corporate documents, her mouth slightly open, unable to comprehend how fast her entire world was collapsing. "You have been bragging all over social media about your new boutique gym, Sarah," I said, my voice echoing loudly in the quiet study. "You paraded around calling your husband a brilliant entrepreneur who secured a massive private investment. You looked down on me for working too hard while you spent my stolen money to build your fake luxury life. There was no private investor. Your entire business is funded by a federal wire fraud scheme orchestrated by your brother-in-law." Pastor Thomas let out a loud gasp and stood up from his desk, stepping away from Marcus and Trey, as if they were suddenly contagious. Vivian covered her face with her hands, letting out a high-pitched wail of absolute horror. She finally realized the perfect men she had been fiercely defending were nothing but common thieves. The fake united front of the family completely shattered in an instant. Trey slammed the folder shut and jumped to his feet, his face red with panic and rage. He pointed a shaking finger at Marcus, demanding to know what he had done. Trey screamed that Marcus had promised him the money came from a legitimate business loan. Marcus shrunk back into his chair, holding his hands up and stammering uncontrollably. He tried to claim it was just a temporary loan and that he was planning to pay it all back before I even noticed the money was missing. He looked frantically at his mother, begging her to defend him again, but Vivian just sobbed loudly into her hands, completely broken by the undeniable truth. Sarah dropped her leather-bound notebook onto the floor. The calm, condescending therapist persona vanished entirely. She began to hyperventilate, grabbing Trey's arm and screaming that they were going to lose the gym and go to prison. She yelled at Marcus, calling him a stupid criminal and crying that he had ruined her entire life. The quiet, sacred space of the church study had descended into absolute panicked chaos. They were turning on each other like cornered animals, desperately trying to shift the blame to save themselves. I sat perfectly still, watching the glorious destruction of their toxic family dynamic. "You brought me to a church to extort me for $500,000 using guilt and manipulation," I said, raising my voice just enough to cut through their screaming. "But all you did was provide me with a digital audio recording of your complete financial collusion." I reached into my pocket and tapped the side of the digital recorder. Checkmate. I walked out of that church, leaving them to drown in their own toxic panic. My phone rang continuously for the next 48 hours. Vivian left tearful voicemails begging me not to go to the police. Trey sent frantic text messages promising to sell the gym equipment and pay me back every single penny if I just gave him a little more time. Even Sarah tried to call, sending long paragraphs claiming she was a victim of the manipulation of Marcus and had absolutely no idea the initial investment was stolen. I blocked every single one of their numbers. I did not care about their apologies or their desperate attempts to save themselves. I was entirely focused on the legal battlefield. Despite the absolute disaster at the church, the cheap lawyer Marcus hired decided to push forward with the civil lawsuit. He requested a mandatory legal mediation session to discuss the $500,000 palimony settlement. The lawyer was clearly operating under the delusion that I was still intimidated. He was leaning heavily on the outdated myth of common law marriage, believing that simply living in my house gave his client a legal right to my assets. He thought the threat of a public civil trial would force me to open my checkbook. He had absolutely no idea what kind of legal firestorm he was walking into. I did not hire a family law attorney to handle a simple breakup. I hired the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in the entire state of Georgia. I walked into their glass-walled conference room on the top floor of a downtown high-rise and sat down with a team of 3 senior partners. The lead attorney was a sharp, impeccably dressed man who specialized in prosecuting financial fraud and corporate espionage. I did not waste time with emotional stories or tears. I opened my briefcase and laid out the exact same documents I had presented at the church. I gave them the forensic audit, the forged wire transfer, the state corporate registry filings, and a clean copy of the digital audio recording from the pastor's study. Finally, I placed the civil lawsuit Marcus had filed right in the center of the table. I told the legal team I did not want to settle. I told them I wanted to completely annihilate him and anyone who helped him steal from me. The lead attorney read through the palimony lawsuit and then reviewed the forged wire transfer document. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. He looked at me and explained the absolute brilliance of the mistake Marcus had made. By filing a formal civil lawsuit demanding compensation for his alleged financial consulting, Marcus had legally chained himself to the stolen money. The lawsuit was a sworn statement placing him directly inside my financial accounts, during the exact time frame the funds were illegally wired to his brother. The attorney told me that we were going to use the upcoming civil mediation as a trap. We were not going to file a response warning them about the criminal evidence. We were going to let Marcus and his discount lawyer walk into that mediation room, thinking they held all the leverage. We were going to let them place their demands on the official record, and then we were going to drop the federal hammer. The preparations for the mediation were meticulous and completely devoid of any emotion. My legal team drafted a comprehensive referral packet for the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. They compiled every single piece of evidence into a massive indexed binder. We were preparing a criminal referral that would guarantee federal indictments for wire fraud, identity theft, and tax evasion. The days leading up to the mediation felt incredibly peaceful. I woke up early, went to the gym, and managed my business with absolute clarity. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt for what I was about to do to the man I once thought I loved. He had looked at my success and seen a bank account he could endlessly drain. He had looked at my loyalty and seen a weakness he could exploit. He had mocked me to his friends and used my own money to fund a fake empire for his family. I was just balancing the ledger. The morning of the mediation arrived with a crisp, cool breeze blowing through the city. I put on a tailored charcoal gray power suit and tied my hair back into a sleek, tight bun. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who had completely reclaimed her power. I grabbed my briefcase and headed downtown to meet my lawyers. The trap was perfectly set, and I was ready to watch it snap. The glass doors of the downtown arbitration center slid open with a soft, mechanical hum. I walked into the expansive marble lobby flanked by my legal team. The three senior partners from the corporate litigation firm walked in perfect sync right beside me. They wore meticulously tailored navy and charcoal suits, carrying thick leather portfolios that screamed absolute authority. I was wearing my dark gray power suit, my hair pulled back sharply, and my heels clicking against the polished stone floor with the steady rhythm of a metronome. We did not look like a group of people arriving to negotiate a messy family dispute. We looked like a corporate execution squad arriving to liquidate a bankrupt company. The receptionist directed us to Conference Room B on the 14th floor. As we stepped out of the elevator, the heavy oak doors of the conference room were already wide open. I could hear loud laughter echoing down the quiet hallway. Marcus, Trey, and Sarah were already inside, and they had clearly decided to turn a formal legal proceeding into a casual family gathering. I walked through the doorway and took in the absolute absurdity of the scene. Marcus was leaning far back in an expensive ergonomic chair, with his feet practically resting on the polished mahogany conference table. He was wearing a flashy patterned shirt with the top two buttons undone, trying to project the image of a wealthy tech founder who was too busy and important for formal business attire. Trey was standing by the large floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a cup of complimentary coffee and pointing out the city skyline to Sarah. Sarah was wearing a bright floral dress, holding her designer handbag on her lap and smiling with the insufferable smugness of a woman who genuinely believed she had just won the lottery. Sitting at the far end of the table was the discount personal injury lawyer Marcus had hired. He was a middle-aged man with a poorly fitted beige suit and a cheap plastic briefcase resting open in front of him. When we walked into the room, the laughter died instantly. The cheap lawyer looked up from his scattered papers, and his eyes widened as he took in the sight of my legal team. He recognized the lead partner of my firm immediately. The blood drained from his face as he realized he was entirely out of his depth. Marcus, however, was completely oblivious to the sudden shift in the room. He dropped his feet to the floor and sat up, giving me a condescending smirk. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," Marcus said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. "I was starting to think you were going to dodge this mediation, Chloe. I am glad you brought your lawyers, though. It is time for you to finally take accountability and pay me what I am owed. We can wrap this up in an hour if you just sign the settlement paperwork and wire the funds." Sarah chimed in from the window, nodding her head in enthusiastic agreement. "We are really just doing this to be fair to Marcus," she said, using her sickly sweet voice. He gave you the best years of his life and built your brand. We are willing to completely forget about the embarrassing stunt you pulled at the nightclub if you just do the right thing today. It is really the most mature way to handle this. Chloe. Trey crossed his arms and stared at me, trying to look intimidating. Just write the check, Chloe Trey added. Save yourself. The public embarrassment of a trial. I did not say a single word in response to their delusions. I pulled out my chair and sat down at the head of the table, perfectly upright. My three elite attorneys took their seats, flanking me like a fortress of legal destruction. They moved with terrifying precision, placing their thick, identical binders onto the mahogany table in complete unison. The sheer professionalism radiating from my side of the room made the opposing lawyer look like a complete amateur. He nervously cleared his throat and adjusted his crooked tie. He opened a thin manila folder and tried to project a voice of authority. Well, then let us get started, he stammered, looking directly at my lead attorney instead of me. My client is seeking a palimony settlement of exactly $500,000 and a 20% equity stake in your financial firm. We believe this is a highly reasonable demand based on his extensive contributions to the household and his undocumented daily consulting work. If your client agrees to these terms today, my client is willing to sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding their personal relationship and keep this quiet. My lead attorney did not blink at the ridiculous threat echoing across the mahogany table. He slowly opened his thick leather binder and smoothed a single piece of paper flat against the wood. He looked directly at the discount lawyer sitting across from us, ignoring Marcus and his obnoxious posture. Counsel! My attorney began, his voice smooth and dripping with professional disdain. Your entire civil complaint is entirely predicated on the legal framework of common law marriage. Because your client resided in the same household as my client for 4 years, he is legally entitled to palimony and a 20% equity stake in a firm. The opposing lawyer nodded nervously, pulling at the collar of his beige suit. That is correct, he stammered, trying to sound confident. They cohabitated. They presented themselves as a couple to their social circles, and my client made significant undocumented contributions to her corporate success. We have numerous witnesses who can testify to their shared domestic life. My lead attorney let out a very soft, dry chuckle. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a heavy, hardbound copy of the State Civil Statute Codebook. He dropped it onto the table with a loud, solid thud, making Sarah jump slightly in her chair. He opened the heavy book to a bookmarked page and pushed it across the polished wood until it was sitting directly in front of the opposing counsel. That is a lovely story, counsel, my attorney said, leaning back in his chair. However, as any competent legal professional practicing family or civil law in this jurisdiction should immediately recognize, the state of Georgia formally abolished the legal concept of common law marriage on January 1st, 1997. Unless a couple established their common law status before that specific date, the court does not recognize cohabitation as a legal partnership, regardless of how many years they live together or how many witnesses you bring to the stand. Marcus dropped his feet from the table instantly. He looked back and forth between his lawyer and my legal team, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Wait, what does that mean? Marcus asked loudly, his voice losing all its previous arrogance. What is he talking about? Man, tell him we lived together for 4 years. His lawyer did not answer. He was staring down at the statute book, his face turning a sickly shade of pale white. He had clearly filed the lawsuit hoping I would simply panic and settle out of court, without ever hiring proper representation to challenge his flimsy legal basis. He never expected to be sitting in a room with corporate litigators quoting state statutes. My attorney did not give them a single second to recover. What it means, Marcus, is that you have absolutely zero legal standing in this state, my attorney explained, locking eyes with him. You were never married to my client. You do not have a signed domestic partnership agreement. You do not have a signed corporate contract granting you equity in Apex Financial Consulting. In the eyes of the law, you are nothing more than a long-term house guest who contributed zero financial capital to the property or the business. You have exactly as much legal right to her assets as the man who delivers her mail. The smugness wiped completely off the faces of the villains in real time. Sarah dropped her hands from her designer handbag, her mouth slightly open in stunned disbelief. Trey stepped away from the window, his arms uncrossing as the reality of the situation rapidly set in. The imaginary gold mine they thought they had tapped into was vanishing right before their eyes. Marcus slammed his hands down on the table. "That is completely ridiculous," he shouted, his face flushing red with anger. "I helped her build that business. I went to the networking events. I advised her on high-level client acquisitions. I was basically a consultant. You cannot just use me for 4 years and kick me out with nothing." My attorney smiled a cold, predatory smile. "That is a very interesting pivot, Marcus," my attorney said softly. "Because if you are abandoning the common law marriage argument and instead claiming that you operated as a formal corporate consultant for Apex Financial Consulting, then we need to discuss the exact nature of your financial access. You stated in your sworn lawsuit that you had intimate knowledge of her accounts and actively participated in managing her portfolio. Is that still your official position today?" "Yes, it is," he said defiantly. "I was intimately involved in moving money and managing her assets." My attorney looked at me and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Marcus had just taken the bait perfectly. The trap was locked permanently and securely shut. The trap was locked permanently and securely shut. My lead attorney did not smile, but his eyes were entirely devoid of mercy. He reached back into his thick leather binder and pulled out the exact copy of the civil lawsuit Marcus and his lawyer had officially filed with the county clerk. He slid the document to the center of the table and tapped his expensive pen against the third page. "In paragraph 4 of your sworn civil complaint, you claim you had unrestricted access to the corporate accounts of my client," my attorney said, reading directly from the paper. "In paragraph 7, you state under penalty of perjury that you were the primary architect of her financial transfers during the 4th quarter of last year. You signed this legal document and submitted it to a judge, claiming it was the absolute truth." Marcus puffed out his chest and nodded again, completely missing the extreme danger closing in around him. "That is right," Marcus said. "I managed her money, so I deserve my cut of the profits." The opposing discount lawyer, however, suddenly stopped breathing. He was a bad lawyer, but he was not entirely stupid. He saw the trap the moment my attorney emphasized the specific time frame and the concept of a sworn statement. The discount lawyer reached out with a shaking hand and tried to pull the lawsuit document back across the table, but my attorney slammed his hand flat over the paper, stopping him completely. "It is entirely too late to retract this document, counsel," my attorney said, staring a hole straight through the man. "It is already a matter of public record." My attorney opened the second folder on his side of the table. He pulled out the bank-certified forensic audit and the forged wire transfer document from the trust account. He placed the wire transfer right next to the sworn lawsuit. "Exactly 4 months ago, during the precise 4th quarter timeframe, you swore you were managing the financial transfers of my client. Someone forged her signature," my attorney explained, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous volume. "Someone bypassed the security protocols on her private trust and illegally wired $150,000 to an external commercial checking account." Marcus stared at the wire transfer document. The remaining color drained completely out of his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "You see, Marcus?" My attorney continued, leaning forward and clasping his hands together. "We were actually preparing to launch a massive investigation to prove exactly who gained unauthorized access to that specific trust account. Proving identity theft and wire fraud can sometimes be a very lengthy and complicated legal process. But you just made our jobs incredibly easy. By filing this ridiculous civil lawsuit demanding palimony, you explicitly provided a signed sworn confession to the court. You legally placed yourself inside her financial accounts during the exact moment the money was stolen. You literally drafted, signed, and filed your own criminal confession, and then you paid a lawyer to deliver it to us. The silence in the conference room was absolute and suffocating. The discount lawyer dropped his pen. It clattered loudly against the table. He looked at Marcus with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. "You forged a wire transfer," the discount lawyer whispered, his voice cracking with panic. "You told me you were an authorized user on a joint account. You lied to me, and you used my law firm to file a fraudulent extortion claim against a federal crime victim." Sarah let out a high-pitched gasp. She grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning completely white. Trey stumbled backward, hitting the window behind him. They both suddenly realized the catastrophic magnitude of the situation. Marcus had not just confessed to stealing the money. By linking himself to the financial management of my accounts, he had officially linked the stolen funds directly to their new boutique gym. "I did not mean to," Marcus stammered, holding his hands up defensively. "It was just a temporary loan. I was going to put the money right back into the trust before she even noticed. You cannot use this lawsuit against me like that. It is a civil claim, not a criminal case." My lead attorney finally smiled. The smile was cold and completely terrifying. "Actually, Marcus, we absolutely can use it against you," my attorney said. "A sworn statement submitted to a state judge is admissible evidence in any court in this country. You tried to use the legal system to bully my client into paying you $500,000. Instead, you just handed us the exact weapon we needed to completely destroy your entire life forever." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the cool mahogany table, and looked directly at the discount lawyer. "You can put your pen down, counsel," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of any sympathy. "We are not going to negotiate a financial settlement today. We are not going to sign a non-disclosure agreement to keep this quiet. In fact, we are not even going to file a civil countersuit against your client for the stolen funds. We have absolutely no interest in spending the next 2 years fighting over pennies in a state civil court." The discount lawyer looked at me, his hands shaking slightly as he closed his cheap plastic briefcase. "If you are not filing a civil response, then what exactly is the purpose of this mediation?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. My lead attorney answered for me, sliding a thick, sealed envelope across the table. "That is a courtesy copy of the federal referral packet my team finalized yesterday afternoon," my attorney explained. "We did not bring these documents here to leverage a better deal. We brought them here to inform you that your client is entirely out of time. Yesterday morning, my firm officially submitted the bank-certified forensic audit, the forged wire transfer documents, the state corporate registry filings, and a certified copy of your civil lawsuit directly to the White-Collar Crime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Sarah let out a choked sob, covering her mouth with both hands. Trey gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as he stared at the sealed envelope like it was a live explosive. But we did not stop there. I continued, turning my attention to Trey and Sarah. "You used stolen money to fund the opening of Apex Elite Fitness. You funneled stolen corporate assets through a private trust and into a commercial business account without declaring the origin of the capital." So my legal team also forwarded the entire evidentiary packet to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. They are going to audit every single penny that went into your boutique gym. They are going to freeze your commercial accounts, seize your equipment, and indict both of you for federal tax evasion and money laundering. Marcus jumped up from his expensive ergonomic chair, his flashy patterned shirt suddenly soaked with nervous sweat. "Chloe, you cannot do this," he pleaded, holding his hands out toward me. "Please, baby, just listen to me. We can fix this right now. I will drop the palimony lawsuit today. I will sign whatever paper you want me to sign. I will give you the equity in the gym. Just call your lawyers off and tell the federal agents it was a misunderstanding. Tell them we had a verbal agreement." I looked at him with absolute disgust. The arrogance that had defined his entire personality for the last 4 years was completely gone, replaced by the pathetic desperation of a coward facing real consequences. "You cannot unring a bell, Marcus," I said softly. "The federal government does not care about your apologies or your sudden willingness to drop a fraudulent lawsuit. They care about wire fraud and forged signatures. The investigation is already entirely out of my hands." The discount lawyer stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back so hard it crashed into the wall behind him. He grabbed his briefcase and looked down at Marcus with pure hatred. "I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel effective immediately," the lawyer shouted, his voice echoing in the large room. "You lied to me about your financial access. You used my firm to facilitate an extortion attempt masking a federal crime. Do not ever call my office again." The lawyer did not even look at the rest of the room. He turned around and practically ran out the heavy oak doors, leaving Marcus completely abandoned and legally defenseless. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The illusion of their superiority had been systematically dismantled and crushed under the weight of their own greed. Trey slowly turned his head and looked at his brother. The protective loyalty that had always defined their relationship was rapidly evaporating. Trey realized that Marcus had not just ruined his own life. By forging that signature and filing that stupid lawsuit, Marcus had dragged Trey and Sarah directly into the crosshairs of a federal criminal indictment. The gym they had bragged about, the fake luxury lifestyle they had flaunted on social media, it was all going to be seized by the government. They were going to lose their home, their business, and their freedom, all because Marcus could not control his greed, and they had foolishly chosen to support his toxic criminal behavior. Sarah was the first to physically break the silence. She let out a sound between a gasp and a scream. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. She looked directly at her husband, Trey. "You told me it was a private investment," Sarah yelled, her voice shrill and echoing off the glass walls. "You looked me in the eyes and told me Marcus had secured a legitimate venture capital loan for the gym. You lied to me, Trey. You brought stolen money into my business. I am not going to federal prison for you or him." Trey reached out, trying to grab her arm, but she violently slapped it away. "Sarah, baby, you need to calm down," Trey pleaded, his voice shaking with panic. "We can figure this out. We are a family. We just need to stick together." Sarah let out a hysterical laugh. "Stick together," she screamed. "Are you completely out of your mind? You are looking at a federal indictment for money laundering and tax evasion. The government is going to seize everything we own. They are going to freeze my bank accounts. I am not going down with your sinking ship." Sarah turned her frantic gaze toward my lead attorney. Her carefully constructed image as the composed, superior white woman was gone. She looked desperate and terrified. "Listen to me," Sarah begged, leaning over the table. "I had absolutely nothing to do with that forged signature. I did not know the money was stolen. I will give you every financial record for the gym. I will testify against both of them in federal court. Just tell the FBI that I was an innocent victim here." Trey stared at his wife in absolute shock. The woman who had proudly stood by his side, bragging about their unbreakable bond, was eagerly offering to send him to prison just to save her own skin. The toxic family loyalty that had protected Marcus and enabled Trey evaporated into thin air the second real consequences arrived. "You are really going to snitch on your own husband, Trey?" asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "After everything I did to get you that luxury lifestyle, you are just going to throw me to the feds?" Sarah did not hesitate. "You threw yourself to the feds when you decided to commit wire fraud with your pathetic brother." She snapped back, her face red with rage. "I am calling my lawyer right now and filing for divorce before the government freezes our assets." Sarah grabbed her designer handbag from the table and marched right out of the conference room without looking back. She left her husband standing there completely alone, facing the total destruction of his marriage and his freedom. Trey slowly turned his head. His eyes locked onto Marcus, who was still cowering in his expensive ergonomic chair. The protective older brother dynamic shattered instantly. The anger and humiliation Trey felt from his wife abandoning him was violently redirected at the man who had caused this nightmare. "You did this to me!" Trey shouted, his voice booming with fury. "You forged that signature and brought the feds to my front door. You ruined my life, you selfish parasite!" Marcus held his hands up defensively, shaking his head. "Trey, wait please," Marcus cried out. "I was trying to help us build an empire. I did not know she would audit the trust fund." Trey did not want to hear another word. He lunged across the space between them, grabbing Marcus by the collar of his flashy patterned shirt. He yanked Marcus entirely out of the chair, throwing him hard against the glass wall of the conference room. The heavy thud vibrated through the floor. Marcus shouted in pain, raising his arms to shield his face, as Trey delivered a brutal punch directly to his jaw. My lead attorney calmly reached over and pressed a silver button on the center console, calling for building security. We did not panic or shout. My legal team and I simply watched the two brothers tear each other apart. The golden boys of the family were physically fighting like wild animals over the ruins of their fraudulent lives. Security guards rushed into the room, pulling the two angry men apart and pinning them against opposite walls. Trey was breathing heavily, spitting curses at his brother. Marcus was bleeding from his lip, looking utterly defeated and broken. I stood up and smoothed out my tailored charcoal gray blazer. I picked up my sleek black leather briefcase and gave the two brothers one final cold look of absolute pity. They had completely destroyed themselves forever. I turned around and walked out of the conference room, leaving them to the security guards and the waiting federal authorities. 3 days after the disastrous mediation session, I was sitting behind my desk reviewing a new client portfolio. The heavy glass door to my suite suddenly swung open, hitting the wall with a loud bang. My receptionist stood up quickly, trying to block the intruder, but it was entirely too late. My mother Vivian pushed past the front desk and stumbled directly into my private office. She looked absolutely terrible. Her usually immaculate hair was disheveled, and her eyes were swollen and red from days of constant crying. She was clutching a crumpled tissue in her trembling hands. Vivian collapsed into one of the leather guest chairs across from my desk and immediately began to sob hysterically. "Chloe, you have to stop this!" she cried out, her voice cracking with desperation. "You have to call those lawyers and tell them to cancel the investigation. The FBI raided the gym this morning. They took all the computers and locked the doors. Trey is terrified, and Marcus will not even answer his phone. You are destroying your family over a stupid mistake. You have to fix this mess right now before they lose everything." I calmly closed the portfolio I was reading and set my pen down. I looked at my mother and felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left in my chest. There was only a cold, hollow exhaustion. I told my receptionist it was fine and motioned for her to close the office door. Once we were completely alone, the silence in the room felt incredibly heavy. "You have enough money to let this go," Vivian begged, leaning forward and reaching her hand out across my desk. "They are facing federal prison. Chloe, Trey is your brother. He has a wife who is leaving him. Marcus was supposed to be your husband. They were trying to build something for themselves and they took a shortcut. If you tell the federal agents that you gave them verbal permission to borrow the money, they will drop the charges. Please just lie to them. Protect your own family. Do not let them take your brother away." I stared at the woman who had brought me into this world. She was actually sitting in my professional workplace, actively begging me to commit a federal crime just to save two men who had intentionally robbed me. "You are asking me to commit perjury and risk my own freedom to protect a thief and a fraud." I said, my voice low and dangerously steady. "You want me to sacrifice my entire career, my reputation, and my future, so Trey and Marcus do not have to face the consequences of their own deliberate actions. This is exactly what you have done. Your entire life, Vivian. You have spent decades building a pedestal for mediocre men, and then demanding that the women around you lay down and bleed just to keep that pedestal from tipping over." Vivian gasped, pulling her hand back as if she had been burned. "How can you say that?" she sobbed, shaking her head. "I am your mother. I am just trying to keep this family together through a terrible crisis." "You never cared about keeping the family together," I replied, standing up from my chair. "You only cared about keeping the men comfortable. When Marcus spent my money and refused to work, you praised him when he was caught on camera, humiliating me and admitting he had to get drunk just to touch me. You told me to swallow my pride and keep it quiet. When they stole to build a fake empire, you wanted me to pay them $500,000. You expect me to be the sacrificial lamb for their incompetence? I am breaking that generational curse right here and right now. I will not diminish my success to make weak men feel strong, and I will not go to federal prison to cover up their crimes." Vivian stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as the reality of my words finally pierced through her delusions. She realized she had completely lost control over me. "The federal investigation is out of my hands and I would not stop it even if I could," I said, walking around my desk and opening the heavy office door. "You chose to align yourself with parasites, Vivian. You chose to defend the people who abused me. Because of that, you no longer have a daughter. Do not come to my office ever again. Do not call my phone. Do not show up at my house. We are entirely finished." Vivian stood up slowly, her shoulders slumped in total defeat. She walked out of my office without saying another word, finally understanding that the bridge between us was now permanently burned to the ground. The weeks that followed my final confrontation with Vivian moved with a quiet and deeply satisfying efficiency. The federal government moved with a swift and terrifying precision that no discount lawyer could ever negotiate away. It started on a bright Tuesday morning when my phone buzzed with a breaking news alert from a local Atlanta television station. The headline was incredibly clear. A high-end boutique gym in the downtown commercial district had been raided by federal agents in connection with a massive wire fraud and money laundering investigation. I clicked on the video link and watched the glorious footage. Half a dozen black government vehicles were parked directly on the sidewalk outside Apex Elite Fitness federal agents, wearing dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across their backs, were carrying heavy cardboard boxes of financial records out the front doors. A pair of agents was wrapping bright yellow crime scene tape around the polished brass handles of the main entrance, while confused members in expensive workout gear stood on the sidewalk watching their exclusive gym get permanently shut down. Trey and Marcus were officially indicted on multiple federal charges, including wire fraud, bank fraud, and tax evasion. The illusion of their entrepreneurial success evaporated overnight, and the brutal reality of the criminal justice system crushed their arrogant egos. Sarah reacted exactly the way I knew she would. The moment the federal agents showed up at her front door, she immediately filed for an emergency divorce, trying to legally sever herself from Trey and his crimes. She completely abandoned the husband she had constantly bragged about, hoping to throw him under the bus to save her own luxurious lifestyle. She even tried to post another dramatic essay on her social media platforms, claiming she was a naive victim who had been financially manipulated by the toxic men in her family. But the Internal Revenue Service did not care about her online victimhood or her tears. The government officially froze all of her personal bank accounts and placed a heavy lien on her suburban colonial home. Her luxury vehicles were seized, and her social media accounts suddenly went completely dark as she realized her white privilege could not shield her from a federal audit. Marcus fared even worse than his brother and sister-in-law. He had no assets to leverage and no legal defense to offer. The young, beautiful mistress who had been more than happy to drink expensive champagne on my dime packed her bags and left him the exact same day. The news of the federal indictments broke. She did not even leave a note. His entire network of fake wealthy friends, the men he used to desperately try to impress, completely abandoned him. They blocked his phone number and pretended they had never even met him, terrified that his federal fraud charges would somehow draw the attention of the authorities to their own shady business dealings. Marcus was left completely alone with absolutely nothing to his name. Because of the severity of the federal charges and his clear lack of legitimate income, the judge set his bail at a massive amount that nobody in his family could afford to pay. My phone rang late on a Friday evening while I was sitting in my living room reading a book. The caller identification displayed a number originating from the county detention center. I answered the call and listened to the automated robotic voice informing me that I had a collect call from an inmate at the county jail. I pressed the button to accept the charges. The line clicked, and the sound of heavy breathing echoed through the speaker. "Chloe, please do not hang up." Marcus sobbed, his voice echoing off the cold concrete walls of his holding cell. "Please, baby, you have to help me. I am so sorry for everything I said and everything I did. I was just stupid and insecure. I cannot survive in this place. You are the only person who ever truly loved me, and the only one who can fix this. I am begging you to call your lawyers and get me out of here." I listened to the pathetic sound of his crying. I thought about the arrogant smirk on his face when he stood on my porch bragging to his brother. I thought about the 4 years he spent draining my bank accounts and making me feel like I was never quite enough. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling completely detached from the broken man crying on the other end of the line. "I would have to be blackout drunk just to listen to your voice, Marcus," I said calmly. I pressed the red end button on my digital screen and hung up the phone. The silence that filled my living room after the line went dead was the most exquisite sound I had ever experienced. I did not sit there and cry or second-guess my decision. I simply walked over to my kitchen drawer, pulled out a small metal pin, and ejected the SIM card from my digital device. I snapped the tiny plastic square perfectly in half and dropped the pieces into the garbage disposal. The next morning, I drove directly to my mobile carrier and opened a brand new secure private account. I walked out with a new device and an unlisted phone number that I only shared with my top-tier corporate clients and my absolute closest professional colleagues. The direct line of communication to my toxic past was permanently severed. But changing a phone number was only the first minor step in completely sanitizing my life. I knew the desperate panic of my family would only escalate as the federal indictments moved closer to trial. Vivian would undoubtedly try to ambush me again, and Sarah might attempt to show up at my property to beg for legal funds. I was not going to give them the opportunity to violate my peace a second time. I contacted an elite private security firm that specialized in executive protection. Within 48 hours, a team of technicians had completely overhauled the perimeter of my home. They installed high-definition night vision cameras, biometric locks on every single door, and a reinforced automated security gate at the end of my long driveway. I formally revoked the emergency access codes Vivian had possessed for years. I also upgraded the security protocols at my financial firm, issuing strict instructions to building management and my reception staff. I formally registered my mother, my former fiancé, his brother, and his soon-to-be ex-wife on a strict trespass list with the local police precinct and my neighborhood homeowners association. If any of them even parked a vehicle within 500 feet of my property, law enforcement would be immediately dispatched to arrest them. The psychological shift that occurred over the next few weeks was absolutely profound. Society constantly conditions women to believe that cutting off family members is a tragic failure. We are told that we must forgive and forget, that blood is thicker than water, and that setting rigid boundaries is inherently selfish. I felt none of those things. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or lingering sadness. I felt an immense, overwhelming, and deeply profound sense of peace. For 4 entire years, my existence had been defined by a constant underlying current of anxiety. I had spent every waking moment trying to manage the fragile ego of a man who secretly hated me, and navigating the manipulative demands of a mother who only valued me for my bank account. I had been carrying the suffocating weight of their collective mediocrity on my shoulders. Now that heavy toxic weight was entirely gone. I woke up every morning in a quiet, beautiful home that belonged solely to me. I drank my coffee on my patio without dreading an incoming text message asking for a massive financial bailout or an invitation to a suffocating Sunday dinner. I went to work and focused entirely on expanding my corporate firm without worrying about Marcus embarrassing me at a networking event or draining my trust fund to impress his fake friends. The complete and absolute enforcement of the no contact rule was not a punishment for them. It was a mandatory preservation of my own sanity. I received occasional automated reports from my security gate indicating that a vehicle registered to Vivian had been denied entry at the perimeter. I received an alert from my corporate email server that messages containing the names of Trey or Sarah had been automatically filtered into the junk folder and permanently deleted. I never read a single word of their pathetic apologies or their desperate pleas for mercy. They no longer existed in my reality. They were nothing more than ghosts, trapped in a prison of their own making, fighting federal charges and turning on each other for survival. I spent my quiet evenings reading Relaxing and rediscovering the ambitious, brilliant woman I was before I let them shrink my world. I started traveling for pleasure instead of just for business, taking weekend trips to coastal resorts where nobody knew my name or demanded my money. I slept deeply and completely, waking up fully energized for the first time in my adult life. The deep satisfaction of walking away from abusers is something that cannot be adequately described until you actually experience it. It is the brilliant realization that your love, your energy, and your resources are precious commodities, and you have the absolute right to deny them to anyone who refuses to treat you with basic human respect. I had surgically excised a massive toxic tumor from my life. The wound was completely healed, and I was finally unconditionally free. Exactly 1 year later, I stood on the sprawling glass balcony of my brand new penthouse apartment 50 stories above the bustling streets of Midtown Atlanta. The crisp evening wind whipped around me, carrying the distant hum of the city traffic, but up here everything was perfectly serene. I took a sip of a vintage red wine that cost more than Marcus used to make in an entire month, and smiled as I looked out at the glittering skyline. Moving into this architectural masterpiece was not just a real estate upgrade, it was a physical manifestation of my newly reclaimed energy. When I stopped funding the fake entrepreneurial dreams of a man who secretly despised me, my financial portfolio absolutely exploded. Apex Financial Consulting did not just survive the messy public drama of the federal indictments, we aggressively thrived. Without the constant, suffocating distraction of managing the fragile egos of my toxic family members, I was able to pour 100% of my focus back into my corporate strategy. My business revenue literally tripled in 12 months. I hired 3 new senior partners, expanded my client roster to include several major international accounts, and opened a massive second satellite office down in Miami. I realized that the heavy burden of carrying dead weight had been the only thing holding me back from reaching my true potential. The sheer amount of emotional energy it takes to endure daily psychological abuse is the exact same energy required to build a massive financial empire. I simply redirected my capital into an asset that actually generated a high return on my investment. The universe has a beautifully brutal way of balancing the scales when you finally refuse to accept blatant disrespect. I did not have to lift another finger to destroy the people who tried to ruin my future. I just stepped back and let the trash take itself out. Marcus and Trey both took federal plea deals when their discount lawyers realized the government had an airtight criminal case built directly on the very civil lawsuit they foolishly filed against me. They are currently serving 5-year sentences in a minimum security federal correctional facility, stripped of their designer clothes and their fake luxury personas. Their fraudulent boutique gym was completely liquidated by the Internal Revenue Service to pay off their massive restitution debts. Every single treadmill and heavy weight was auctioned off to the highest bidder. Sarah frantically finalized her divorce, but the federal government still seized all her remaining marital assets, leaving her to move into a tiny rented apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. She works a minimum wage retail job now, entirely stripped of the unearned white privilege and smug superiority she used to flaunt all over social media. My mother Vivian lives completely alone in her quiet, suffocating house, isolated and abandoned by the golden boys she sacrificed her only daughter to protect. She has absolutely no one left to brag about at her traditional Sunday dinners. People always talk about the concept of revenge, as if it requires profound anger and aggressive retaliation. They think revenge is plotting and screaming and trying to make the other person hurt as much as you did. But the absolute greatest revenge I ever took was simply protecting my peace. It was walking out of that church, turning off my phone, and trusting my elite legal team to handle the execution. True power is not proving to a raging narcissist that you are better than them. True power is forgetting they even exist because your daily life has become entirely too vibrant to accommodate their dark shadows. I look out over the beautiful city tonight, and I do not feel any bitterness toward the man who called me boring on a hidden porch camera. I just feel profoundly grateful that his sheer stupidity gave me the perfect legal excuse to completely purge my life of the financial parasites pretending to be my family. Society constantly tells us that we have to be unbreakable under pressure. They tell Black women we have to carry the weight of the entire world on our shoulders. They expect us to suffer in total silence, to forgive the absolutely unforgivable, and to blindly finance the failures of the men around us just to keep the community intact. I say let that heavy burden drop. Let it shatter into a million pieces on the floor. You do not owe anyone your sanity, your hard-earned wealth, or your bright future. You are not a free rehabilitation center for broken, toxic people. Have you ever reached your absolute breaking point and had to use the law to take out the trash in your own life? Have you ever had to walk away from the people you thought loved you just to survive and protect your peace? Tell me your story in the comments below. Like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about reclaiming your absolute power and building your best life. Keep your standards high and your boundaries unbreakable. The story of Chloe offers a profoundly empowering reflection on the necessity of self-preservation, particularly against the societal expectation that women, and specifically Black women, must quietly endure disrespect to hold a family or relationship together. The most critical lesson we can draw from her journey is that true strength is not measured by how much toxic baggage you can patiently carry for others, but by your courage to set unbreakable boundaries and walk away. For years, Chloe was conditioned to shrink her own ambition to finance the illusions of a mediocre, manipulative partner. Her mother and in-laws expected her to act as a silent, compliant sponsor, valuing her only for her financial utility, while simultaneously dismissing her worth as a person. However, her ultimate victory didn't come from matching their hysterical emotional chaos or engaging in a bitter screaming match. It came from cold, calculated detachment. By leaning into hard facts, forensic audits, and the legal system, she systematically removed the emotion from an inherently abusive and parasitic situation. This narrative teaches us that fiercely protecting your peace is never an act of malice. It is an essential act of survival. When you stop funding the comfort of those who secretly resent you, you reclaim the profound energy needed to build your own thriving empire. Chloe's story completely dismantles the damaging myth of the strong but suffering archetype and replaces it with a modern blueprint for radical self-worth and financial independence. You are absolutely not obligated to be the collateral damage in someone else's fraudulent life, and letting the problem handle itself is often the most profound form of justice. Evaluate your own inner circle today and boldly sever the ties with anyone who demands your resources while disrespecting your spirit.